it's Gloria and welcome back to another video. Today's going to be my April reading wrap-up, talking about all the books that I read in the month of April. Now in total, I read 67 books and 2 DNFs, so 69 total. But before you call somebody because you think I'm crazy, 46 of those books were picture books. I have a whole video that I just did right before this talking about all the 46 picture books that I read because of a picture book readathon. I'm not going to cover any of those in this video. I also had a second installment of a bee-themed reading vlog. You can go watch that. None of those books will be covered in this wrap-up either because I covered them at length in that video. That leaves me 16 books to cover in this video, and as usual, I always categorize them into genres or themes. Let's start with classics. I picked up The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. I had such an enjoyable reading experience with this one. This was a book on my classics TBR, and I'm really glad I got to it. This truly is the perfect time to read this book. It is just filled with writing of nature and gardening, things growing and awaiting spring. This is also a really lovely book about friendship and growing up. Thoroughly enjoyable. It was a little bit slow for me at parts, so it wasn't like an all-time favorite read, but I totally understand why it's a classic and very beloved by many. Another classic that I picked up this month is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Yes, friends, I finally did it. I finally read not only Pride and Prejudice, but my first Jane Austen ever. The 2005 movie adaptation is one of my all-time favorite movies, and I finally got to reading this book. I read about 50% of it physically, and then I listened to the last half as an audiobook because I had a free Audible trial, and the audiobook narrated by Rosamund Pike was exquisite. Highly recommend if you haven't experienced that already. But I had a lot of expectation with this book because of how much I love the movie, and my goodness, was this such a good book. And I'm so thankful that I finally read it. It was 5 stars. It was impeccable. It gave me all of the same feels, and of course you get to know the characters so much more than the movie. I understood Mr. Darcy a lot more and all of the other random characters. So I thoroughly loved it, an all-time favorite. It gets me very excited to pick up more Jane Austen. If for whatever reason you're sitting on this one and haven't read it yet, this is your sign. Read it because it was so good. Next up, I picked up All Creatures Great and Small by James Herriot. I picked this up because I needed a book for Buzzwordathon with size words in the title, and I really didn't know much going into it. I didn't realize it was a nonfiction classic. I think I knew that it was about a veterinarian, but I was still very shocked, especially in the opening chapters and throughout this book, of how much this covers veterinary practice. So if you aren't familiar, James Herriot, this is basically his memoir. He wrote this book as well as a few others. It is a multi-book series, and it covers his career as a veterinarian in a small town in Yorkshire, England, primarily dealing with farmers and farm animals. I had a bit of a roller coaster ride with this one. I think right when I first started reading it, I was like, ooh, I really don't like this. This is gonna be a 2-star or a DNF. And then his writing and his storytelling really grew on me, and he was very funny, very witty, clever, jokingly telling these stories and these crazy experiences that he got up to in his first few years of his veterinary career. Each chapter is not necessarily related, but there are 3 main character figures in this book. James Herriot, the person who wrote this, his boss, and his boss's younger brother, who's a bit of a troublemaker, and all the kind of shenanigans that goes around running this business, dealing with farmers, dealing with various townsfolk. The parts that really shocked me, and I should say as a warning because I didn't know going in, and I think if you are at all squeamish about bodily explanations and like very detailed, descriptive, gruesome writing about veterinary practice and surgical practice and farm animals giving birth and him sewing up weird organs and all kinds of other gross stuff happening, those parts kind of threw me off sometimes, and I got a little bit disturbed. So if that's not your cup of tea, I would avoid this one. I also know that this is now quite popular because of the PBS miniseries, which I definitely will be trying to watch, but overall enjoyable. I ended up landing on 4 stars with this one, and I most likely will continue the series. And finally, in the classics category, and really an oddball to throw into this mix, is Jonathan Livingston Seagull. So I picked this one up because I had a random Sunday afternoon when I was perusing Barnes & Noble, and I had about 2 hours to just do whatever I wanted to do in there while I was waiting for my husband. I just sort of walked around Barnes & Noble and picked books off the shelves that I don't necessarily want to buy. But for whatever reason, I saw this one and I decided to pick it up. The only familiarity I had with it is that I know it is one of Ariel Bissett's favorite books. I think she mentioned it in like a video 2-3 years ago, and this book really stumped me. This is really a philosophy book that made me feel super dumb, and I didn't get it. In this book, the main perspective is a seagull, and he dreams of flying and being different than his seagull friends. And initially I thought that this was just gonna be like a first-person perspective from a seagull's point of view, kind of like what The Bees by Lillian Paul was, which is a very unique sci-fi book about a bee and her life. And so I thought, okay, this is just gonna be about like seagulls. But then it went into such a weird place. It went into like levels of heaven and like angel seagulls teaching this seagull, and then other seagulls teaching young seagulls, and the whole point was to like be different and learn to fly. I was just so confused, but I read this whole book in one sitting at a Barnes & Noble. It took me like an hour. It's a very short book, and it's full of photographs too. So yeah, I ended up giving this one like a 1.5 star. I don't know. I just didn't get it. Moving on to graphic novels, I picked up Monster Friends by Katie Van Dorn. This was a recommendation from Paperbacks and Ponytails. Katie, thank you for the recommendation. This was a very sweet children's graphic novel all about friendship, a fun adventure story. I thought it was absolutely adorable. I particularly would recommend this to a child who maybe is thinking about writing or is artistic, because the author's note really just made the book. She wrote about what it took to imagine these characters, and then she has a whole little guide about drawing your own monsters and creating your own story. These next two I picked up because of Kaylin Abridged Springtime Reads video, and I was inspired to pick up some springtime graphic novels, and these definitely did not disappoint with giving the springtime energy. The first one is Pilu of the Woods by May K. Nguyen. This is also a very cute children's graphic novel, both with Monster Friends and this one. It's not an all-time favorite as much as Lightfall was in February, but it was still really enjoyable, and the illustration style is so cute. This one in particular touched on themes of grief and like dealing with anger as a child and processing something that's really hard and not knowing how to process those emotions and taking it out on your family. And so it's about this young girl that runs away into the woods and is trying to process what she's going through. The next and last one in graphic novels is The Sprite and the Gardener. This one was honestly a bit of a dud for me. I ended up giving it 2 stars, and I'm sorry because everyone else seems to love it, but I honestly just really did not like the illustration style. I think I'd much prefer like high contrast and more realistic images. I think this is closer to an anime style, and I think just the pastels threw me off because everything blended together a lot more than like bright and colorful. And the story also lacked a little bit for me. It's about this like little woodland creature, and it goes into a girl's backyard and brings to life some dead plants, and then the gardener's like, oh, I thought I was doing that, and she's like, no, actually I did it. Let's work together to make your garden look nice. So it was a little bit lacking for me. Next up, let's talk about the 3 nonfiction books that I read this month. The first one is The Woman They Could Not Silence by Kate Moore. Kate Moore also wrote The Radium Girls, which I read a couple years ago. Similar to that one, this book will make you so mad because the story that it is covering is just mind-boggling that this happened in real life. This very chunky nonfiction is all about Elizabeth Packard, who was a housewife in the 1860s, and her husband was a pastor, and she expressed some opinions that he did not agree with, and for her opinions he sent her to an insane asylum against her will, and she spent several years there under the care of a really malicious and manipulative and crazy doctor. And this book chronicles all of those experiences. It spans about 10 years. She stood up for herself and made a way during this time. As hard as it was, she did fight for her rights and for other women's rights in asylums, particularly with there needing to be trials before they can be committed, and she did a lot of good stuff, and I learned a lot. My only kind of qualm about this book was that it was a little bit too long. It just could have been condensed and a lot shorter, and it did drag on in certain parts. So it was still very interesting, but it's a commitment if you're going to read it because it's a long one. I then finished The Science of Sleep. I started this back in January with my husband, and this was our nonfiction book that we were reading every night before bed. We read like a couple pages, and for the most part this was a good book. I gave it 3 stars. It just wasn't as good as a previous sleep book that we had read, and that is Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker. That was a fantastic nonfiction on sleep. I didn't mean to compare these two, but I will because they're the books that we've read on sleep, and that one is a lot better. It's a lot more detailed. This one is a lot more like big picture. It kind of felt like a WikiHow answers, like every single page had a different question about sleep. For example, does the school day fit in with my teenager's sleep needs? Why is it the older I get, the worse I sleep? How can I manage my chronic pain to sleep better? Why do I fall asleep on the couch, but then as soon as I go to bed, I'm wide awake? I regularly wake at 3 a.m. How can I get back to sleep? So those are just some examples of some of the questions. It really covers anything you could probably think of, any question that you had about sleep. So it does cover a lot of stuff, but it covers everything very surface level and quickly. It's like 1 or 2 pages about that topic. And there's some fun little infographics and illustrations in here, but overall it was just your average read and didn't really like stand out or was super special. Another 3-star nonfiction was Do Less, A Minimalist Guide to a Simplified, Organized, and Happy Life. I picked this one up in particularly this month because I needed a book for the Read Your Bookshelf challenge, and the challenge for April was to read a book with all 3 of your initials, G, Z, and T. Good luck with finding a book with those 3, and this one was the only one on my TBR with that. So this is like a little quick self-helpy book about minimalism and minimizing your life, particularly in areas around your home, your workplace, and money. And overall there were some quick tips and it was good, but I really didn't learn anything new, and I think I'm farther along on a minimalist journey. Not that I'm really a minimalist, but I've read other information that's kind of already been covered. And so this book felt very like, again, surface level, high level, not super practical, and a lot of stuff really wasn't relevant to me and my life and my situation. Next up, let's talk about the 4 books that I read that have to do with Soviet Russia. Since we were just talking about nonfiction, I'll start with the nonfiction that I read, and that is Mastering the Art of Soviet Cooking by Anya von Bremzen. This was a buddy read with Annie from Annie's Book Nook. We both gave this book 5 stars. Absolutely loved it. This was a fantastic book if you're at all curious what the Soviet experience is like. Of course, I grew up hearing stories of my parents growing up in Soviet Russia and their parents and their lives, but this was like a very detailed explanation of this particular author's family story, her grandmother, her mother, and her experience in Soviet Russia, and then particularly around food. Food is a very important thing to the Russian culture, and so I also just loved that that was kind of the heart of the story. But this was also so much more than just a family memoir or recipes or descriptions of food. This was also a really interesting history lesson, and I feel like I got a much better understanding of Soviet time period and like what life was like living under Stalin. And I was surprised by how self-aware people were. They knew that they were kind of like living in this not ideal situation, but they had to make do with the circumstances that they were living in. And it was just very fascinating, and there was a ton of stuff in here that I related to so much. Another Soviet memoir that I picked up is The Genius Under the Table by Eugene Yelchin. This is a middle grade book technically, and I had read Eugene Yelchin's historical fiction, Breaking Stalin's Nose, in March for middle grade March and really loved it, so I thought I'd pick up his other book. And this is his story of growing up in Soviet Russia as a child, what he experienced, and he has a very interesting illustration style. He particularly goes into detail of what life was living like in a communal setting with other families, and his parents, his grandmother, and him and his brother had to live in one tiny room together. He writes humorously, and this was a very quirky book, but I think also it depicts Soviet life really well. Another middle grade that I picked up, but a historical fiction, is The Blackbird Girls. This book starts off with the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, and it follows 2 young girls who really are enemies at first. They're not friends at all because one is Jewish and the other one is a bully that makes fun of her for being Jewish. So they're not friends, but then they're put into a situation and they're sent off to live with the Jewish girl's grandmother in St. Petersburg, and they become friends. And so ultimately this is a story of friendship. I didn't love this one. I ended up landing on 3 stars. I had a really hard time connecting with the characters and caring about them, and I'm not really sure why. I can't pinpoint what it was that I didn't love about it. I will say this book was very similar to reading Someday We Will Fly, which was a historical fiction that I read in March about World War II and a Jewish girl surviving in Shanghai. These 2 are actually very comparable, so if you've read one, you'll probably love the other, but for some reason both of these didn't work for me. And the last book that I will cover in this Soviet category also didn't really work for me, so much so that I DNF'd it. I did not finish it, and that is Daughters of a Dead Empire by Carolyn Tara O'Neill. I am so sad about this one because this was a 2022 anticipated release. I thought this cover, and still do think that this cover, is stunning. Unfortunately, the contents for me just really didn't work. I think I was slightly hesitant going in because this is a young adult fantasy, and I'm already slightly skeptical with fantasy as well as young adult books, but this one just felt so young adult, and it totally took me out of the story. I was just totally pulled out with the dialogue particularly, and one character who just could not stop swearing, using swear words that didn't even feel necessary at all. Like, I don't really necessarily have a problem with swearing if it makes sense for the story. It really did not make sense for this story. It follows, again, two girls who are enemies at first, really shouldn't be friends. One is Anastasia, one of the lost princesses. Her whole family was recently killed because this starts off right after the revolution and the Tsar's family is murdered, and the other girl is a Bolshevik. I didn't really get too far. I think I got about 20% of the way through, and I just knew that I was gonna hate this whole experience, which is sad because I was drawn into this time period. I haven't really read a historical fiction that is set during the Russian Revolution, so I was looking forward to that, but I just could not get behind the dialogue and the two characters interacting with each other, and I just knew I wasn't gonna like it. I promise we will end on a positive note, but I will talk about one more DNF, one more book that I could not finish, and it is a historical fiction, and that is The Tobacco Wives by Adele Myers. This was also, unfortunately, an anticipated read with a stunning cover. This is a book that is set in the South and has to do with the tobacco industry, which I also wasn't familiar with. I got about 40% of the way through this one. I also could just not connect or care about the main character. I didn't really get it. I wasn't drawn into the story. There was no like motivation behind anything happening. It also felt kind of clumsy, not well written, and I don't even know if I am qualified to judge those kinds of things, but all I know is I wasn't enjoying this book. Sad that this one was such a dud. Now, to end on a high note and with a fantastic historical fiction, and that is The Gown by Jennifer Robson. This was also a buddy read. This one is a multiple perspective historical fiction that has dual timelines, and at first I was a little skeptical with it being 3 separate characters, but they all connected very quickly, and so it became like a continuous storyline instead of jumping all over the place. It made a lot more sense, and I became very invested. The main story is about 2 women who are embroiderers, and they were part of making Queen Elizabeth II's wedding gown. This book is set post World War II England, so that was also a unique perspective because it really didn't have anything to do with the war, but life after the war and still dealing with rationing and the repercussions of everything that happened. This is a great story about friendship. I think this book landed like a 4.25 for me. It was a great book. Things that brought it down with the present timeline. The main character set during present day is finding out about her grandmother and what she did, and I wasn't really invested in her character and her life. So that's also just telling for me with dual timeline historical fictions. Usually the present timeline is the one that sucks. Kind of wish it wasn't there. And I also realized that I hate the trope of like your grandparent didn't tell you the big thing that happened in their life, and so they died and they leave you a box of things and you have to go figure out what happened. I'm like, ugh. People just need to tell each other things. So yeah, something I realized about myself. And I will say also a trigger warning that there is a very detailed sexual assault scene in this book, but it was brief. All in all, a fantastic historical fiction. Loved reading the author's note. I'm curious about Jennifer Robson's writing in the future. Looking at her current backlist, none of the books really sound interesting to me, but I will be keeping an eye out for any new books she writes. And that is it, my friends. I had overall a good experience in April. Read a lot of stuff, too many things. 69 books is a lot. I'm probably most happy that I read a Jane Austen and that it was an amazing experience. So excited for more of that in the future. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I will see you guys in another video soon.